Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I'm just waiting a few moments. I see a few folks are still look like connecting through the audio, so just a moment or two. All right, it looks to me like we're ready, so we'll go ahead and go back on the record. This is the afternoon portion of the Phase 1B hearing and the Kern River applications, where we left things off before we broke for lunch. Mr. Becerra was cross-examining Mr. Torres, and I understand Mr. Becerra has more questions for Mr. Torres, so I will hand things back to you, Mr. Becerra.
Thank you very much. I have to admit, I'm not seeing Mr. Torres on my particular screen.
He's here, I see him, but he may not be. My team is working on, we have pinning that happens. I don't think any of us are pinned yet.
Understood.
And by that happens, I mean, my team does it somehow. I don't know how. There we are. It looks like we have at least the four of us pinned.
Very good.
Becerra.
Good afternoon, Mr. Torres.
Good afternoon, Mr. Becerra.
Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up Mr. Torres's testimony, exhibit KWBA 600? And can we please go to page 6, paragraph 13? Thank you. Mr. Torres, I'm going to ask you a number of questions using the term water year. And by that, I mean a period of time from October 1st of one calendar year till September 30th of the next calendar year. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Is water year a term you're familiar with?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Well, I'm going to use it a little bit. So that's what I mean is that period of time.
Okay.
While you worked at Buena Vista, did you participate in routing water into cells 1, 2, and 2R in 2 water years?
Yes, I did.
And was the first 1995 to 1996?
I believe that to be correct.
Okay, and that here on your paragraph 13, line 13, that's what you're discussing, right?
Correct.
Okay. Do you know whether water year 1995-96 was as wet as water year 2016 to 2017?
The recollection is 2016 was a dry year. December of, let's see, can you repeat the question just to make sure?
Sure, let me break it up a little. Calendar year 2017 was quite wet, is that right?
Correct.
And so it was the portion of 2017 before September 30th that was quite wet, correct?
Correct.
So was that water year 2016 to 2017, was that water year quite wet?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know whether it was wetter than water year 1995 to 1996?
Not without looking at the year percentage of the river.
Okay. Do you know how much water Buena Vista routed into cells 1, 2, and 2R in 95, 96?
I would have to look at water reports to give you that number.
Okay. Did you also participate when Buena Vista routed water into cells 1 and 2 in water year 1998-99?
Yes,
Do you recall how much water Buena Vista routed into those cells in that water year?
I do not recall.
Do you recall if calendar year 1998 was as wet as calendar year 2017?
No, I do not.
Okay. So, Mr. Torres, in your paragraph 13, you discuss interactions between Buena Vista and HMWD. Is that right?
That is correct.
And is HMWD Henry Miller Water District?
That would be correct.
And you discuss how Buena Vista and Henry Miller would conduct exchanges sometimes. Is that right?
Right. And just to clarify, those conversations went through upper management, and I was given direction after their discussions and meetings.
So did you participate in implementing those exchanges?
I was a participant only in scheduling water for diversions.
Okay. And when you say upper management, who do you mean?
Manager, assistant manager, or engineer manager,
Okay.
or both.
What's your understanding of how those exchanges between Buena Vista and Henry Miller would work?
So in my tenure there at Buena Vista, it only happened one time in recollection of my knowledge, was in order to avoid putting water in the cells, Henry Miller would do an exchange from their table A water with Buena Vista water to avoid filling the cells. And Buena Vista in return would get that water in a later year.
And so does that mean that Buena Vista would agree to not store water in the cells and get State Water Project water back later?
I don't know the exact language or the exact exchange agreement, but that was kind of the general thesis of the water in return, whether it was Kern River or state water. It could be a combination. I'd hate to speculate, but it could be a combination of both.
Buena Vista could get paid back with a variety of types of water. Is that accurate?
Correct.
And is it Boswell, the farming company that owns the land within the Henry Miller Water District?
To the best of my knowledge, they're both the same entity.
Okay. And so if Buena Vista did not route water into the cells, then Boswell would be able to farm land instead of having it flooded. Is that right?
That would be correct.
And then Buena Vista would get water back from some other source. Is that accurate?
That would be accurate.
Okay. Well, if the water that Buena Vista would not take under these exchanges, where would it end up?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. And let me break it up a little bit. So Buena Vista would not divert water into the cells as part of these exchanges. Is that right?
Correct.
So the water that Buena Vista didn't divert, where did it go?
It could go to two places. It could either go into the intertie, or it would go up north towards the Tulare Lake Basin through the outlet through the Kern River flood channel.
So sometimes because Buena Vista agreed to an exchange, the water went through the intertie. Is that right?
Could be a possibility.
Okay. Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up exhibit Buena Vista 108? And Mr. Torres, could you Have you ever seen this letter before?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Could you please take a look at the first 2 pages of it, of this document?
Okay. Can we slow down a little bit, Ms. Mullen? Okay. Okay.
So, Mr. Torres, does this document describe the exchange for 1995-96 in which you participated?
I would
You were
have, by looking at it, I would say that that's probably the document.
Okay, no, thank you very much. So it describes how Buena Vista got water back from Henry Miller for not filling the cells. Is that right?
That's apparently what this letter is about, yes.
Okay. Do you know about any of the exchanges that Buena Vista and Henry Miller undertook before you began working at Buena Vista?
No, I don't.
Okay. All right, Ms. Vaughn, can we please go back to Mr. Torres's testimony, KWBA 600? And can we please scroll down to paragraphs 14 and 15? And actually, let's just stop there. So, Mr. Torres, in your testimony, paragraphs 14 and 15, you discuss how cells 1, 2, and 2R would operate in your experience. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. Ms. Mon, can we scroll down to the next page, please? Actually, I apologize, Ms. Mon. Can we go back up to page 6? And a little bit further, please. Okay, and so there, Mr. Torres, do you see on lines 14 and 15, you talk about how the cells would be filled?
Yes, I do.
And you say this was after Lake Isabella was built, is that right?
That is correct, and that is based on the 62 to date file.
And why was Lake Isabella important to understanding how the cells would operate?
I don't, if there must be a misinterpretation, there's, all I did was put that word in there or that sentence just to say that after Isabella was built. I didn't do any research or anything before that. I'm basically just stating, based on the 62 to date, what I saw after Lake Isabella was built was this is the way they normally, they did it after Lake Isabella.
Your statement's based on your review of the 62 to date file, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And just for the record, that's exhibit KWBA 602, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Were you Buena Vista's hydrographer in 2006?
Yes, I was.
Do you recall whether the Army Corps of Engineers began restricting storage in Lake Isabella in 2006?
I don't recall which year it was, but there was 2006. I don't recall. I recall the 20th when they did this dam safety, but I don't recall what year it was. Maybe it was that 2006.
Do you remember why the Army Corps restricted Isabella storage?
It was a safety and dam issue.
Do you know whether the Army Corps' restriction was still in place in 2017?
I believe so.
And your 62 to date file, that covers the years 1962 to 2013, is that right?
That is correct.
Do you know whether Lake Isabella was operating at full storage capacity during those years?
Can you be more specific on the years?
Yeah, I'll be more specific. You worked at Buena Vista between 1989 and 2014, is that right?
Correct.
Do you know whether Lake Isabella operated at full capacity during the time you worked at Buena Vista?
I believe so, up to the point of the dam and safety issues.
Okay. And so is it fair to say Buena Vista had less Isabella storage space available to it in 2017 than it did in 1996?
Possibly so.
Ms. Mullen, can we please go to exhibit KWBA 602? And can we please go to page 21? And Mr. Torres, I'm just going to direct your attention to the columns on the left side, which are entitled BVWSD Reservoir Losses, BV Lake and Bavara. Did you prepare this page of the exhibit?
No, I didn't.
So do you know what the numbers in those columns mean?
I would think that they are any losses in the aquatic lake, Buena Vista Aquatic Lake recreational area, and also if there was water in the lake cells 1, 2, and 2R.
Okay. And do you see 1983 in this table?
Yes.
And do you see that the stated loss number is 31,000 acre feet?
Yes, I do.
And I'll just ask, do you know how much of that loss was from cells 1, 2, and 2R?
I wasn't employed at Buena Vista at that time, so I'm not sure what those numbers would be.
Okay, thank you. And would your answer be similar for 1986?
Yes.
Okay. I have no further questions for Mr. Torres, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. Do any of the other parties have questions for Mr. Torres? I do not have questions at this time. Mr. O'Brien, do you have redirect for Mr. Torres?
I do not.
Thank you. I believe then with that, we've completed our examination of Mr. Torres. Mr. Torres, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your time and very much appreciate your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe at this point, am I correct, Mr. O'Brien, that we have completed KWBA's rebuttal, presentation of KWBA's rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
Is that correct? And then at this time, are you prepared to offer KWBA's rebuttal exhibits into evidence?
That would depend on whether Ms. Tokar is prepared. So I'm going to ask, I think she is because we talked about it earlier. There she is.
And I can, what I'll do, Ms. Tokar, is I will list off what I had identified, I think, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong about what the relevant exhibit numbers are. So at this time, Mr. O'Brien or Ms. Tokar, would you like to offer KWBA's exhibits KWBA 25 through 37, KWBA 151 through 159, KWBA 249 through 251, and KWBA 328 through 336 into the evidentiary record?
Yes, and I have a few corrections actually. So
Okay, good. Let's go through those.
yeah, so you're correct. KWBA 025 through 037.
Mhm.
KWBA 151 through 159. KWBA 249 through 253. That includes Ms. Boissevain's corrections.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then KWBA 328C, that is the corrected version that we emailed out over the lunch break.
And I saw that come in. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And then also KWBA 336C.
So it'll be so 328C, and then inclusive of, there was a 329 through 335, and then 336C.
That's
accurate?
correct. And then Mr. Torres's testimony, KWBA 600 through 602.
I got it all, but yeah, I missed that. Thank you.
No problem.
Are there any outstanding objections to the admission of these exhibits into the evidentiary record that I haven't already dealt with through the evidentiary ruling of last Friday?
Ms. Kinsey, I'd just like to take a quick minute to review the email that we received
Absolutely.
a little bit ago. Just for clarification, I believe the only correction on 336C is on slide 9. Is that right?
That's correct. Slide 9, the first bullet point.
Yeah, those appear to be in order.
And I will just add the caveat, if for any reason, I realize these just came in on the lunch, if something comes up later that there seems to be a discrepancy between what we talked about and what's reflected in the corrected exhibits, I would certainly consider that, later on. Mr. Becerra, do you need additional time or do you have any other concerns?
No.
Thank you. Does anyone else have something to raise before we move these exhibits into the evidentiary record? All right, with that, I will accept into the evidentiary record the KWBA rebuttal exhibits identified by Ms. Tokar. They're accepted into the evidentiary record, to be clear, for phase 1B of this proceeding.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe next on our agenda will be Buena Vista rebuttal testimony. So Mr. Becerra, I'll turn to you. are you prepared at this time to call your first witness, or do you need a few moments to sort things out?
We do need a few minutes to set up.
Okay, I'll give you 5 minutes. Let's just come back in 5 minutes at 1:50.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Becerra, are you prepared to call your first witness?
Yes.
Hearing
Thank you.
officer, I have just a process question,
Sure, Mr.
and I'm
Cuny, go
sorry
ahead.
to interrupt, Ryan, I apologize. When is it that would you want us to move exhibits? We examined Mr. Parker with an exhibit. I have other exhibits as well, and I just want to be consistent with whatever practice you want to follow in that regard.
It's a good question. One of my team asked me the same thing. I think what I will do is we can go ahead and do those with the rest of your exhibits. We'll just do them all at once, and then I'll have to circle back to you, Mr. O'Brien, for any cross exhibits that KWBA may have. But I think that way would just be relatively efficient. So
That's fine. I just said I want to make sure we're doing it the right way. Thank you.
I think there's no right or wrong, but I think that will work. So let's do that. Thank you. Anything else before we get started? All right, back to you, Mr. Becerra.
Thank you. Buena Vista Water Storage District calls Andrew Bell as a witness.
Thank you. And I see you, Mr. Bell. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Will you please raise your right hand? Mr. Bell, do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Mr. Becerra, you may proceed.
And Ms. Mullen, can you please bring up exhibit Buena Vista 1001? And Ms. Kinsey, just for housekeeping purposes, we've allotted Mr. Bell 10 minutes of our 80 minutes.
Thank you.
Mr. Bell, can you please state your name for the record?
Andrew Bell.
And have you submitted your resume in this hearing previously?
I have, yes.
Is exhibit Buena Vista 1000 your written rebuttal testimony?
It is.
Is exhibit Buena Vista 1001 your summary of your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, it is.
And is exhibit Buena Vista 1002 your exhibit to your rebuttal testimony?
Yeah, it is.
Using exhibit Buena Vista 1001, can you please provide a summary of your testimony?
Sure. Ms. Mullins, if we could go to the next slide. So the essence of my rebuttal applies to Dr. David's testimony. In his exhibit, KWBA 146, he was looking for the upper range of theoretical Kern River diversions. And in column 14 of his exhibit, he listed 35,000 acre feet for the average canal seepage in the Buena service area. And this applied to all time periods listed in his chart. When we look at Dr. David's testimony, which is Water Bank Exhibit 100, he indicated in his formula that this average number, this 35,000 acre feet, was used as a component of this computation to try to get this upper range of this theoretical Kern River diversions. If we could go to the next slide, Ms. Mullen. So in exhibit 1002, Buena Vista exhibit that we have a snippet shown on the screen, what this shows is a canal losses, canal seepage in the Buena service area. Now, again, this is a document that was kept in the normal course of business. Mr. Torres would have worked on this document. I worked on this document during my time at Buena Vista. And so if we notice in column heading 2 for Buena Vista canal losses, there's a good number of years that are well above 35,000 acre feet, starting in 1969, and a fair number of years during the late 70s and early 80s, well above 40 and 45,000. So again, the point of highlighting this is that using what Dr. Davids asserted was an average number of seepage in the Buena service area to try to get an upper range diversion really isn't appropriate. And this record here is just an evidence that frequently canal seepage in the Buena service area would be well above 35,000 acre feet. And that concludes the summary of my rebuttal testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. And Mr. Becerra, I think that was well under 10 minutes, so have some credit in the bank.
I have one question for Mr. Bell. I think he made one misstatement. I just need to
Please.
clarify for the record. Could we please bring up Buena Vista 1001, Ms. Mullen? And could we please go to the third page? Mr. Bell, I believe at one point you referred to column 2 as Buena Vista Canal losses. It's actually Button Willow Canal losses. Is that correct?
And that's correct. This would apply to losses in the Button Willow service area.
And with that, Ms. Kinsey, Mr. Bell is available for cross-examination.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. Mr. O'Brien, do you have questions for Mr. Bell?
I do. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bell. We've met
Good afternoon.
before. I'm Kevin O'Brien, representing the Kern Water Bank Authority. Ms. Mullen, if we could pull up Mr. Bell's rebuttal testimony, BV 1000, and go to page 5, paragraph 12, please. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about this paragraph, Mr. Bell, so maybe you could just take a few seconds and review it just to refresh your memory about it.
Sure. Give me a moment. Okay.
Now, in this paragraph 12 of your rebuttal testimony, you discuss recharge that has occurred through losses from Buena Vista's distribution canals. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you refer to exhibit Buena Vista 1002, which I believe is a spreadsheet that provides in additional detail some of those losses, and we're going to talk about those here in a minute, but that's the spreadsheet, or at least a portion of it, that we just saw on your PowerPoint. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. There was a snippet of that in my exhibit.
Now, you talk about towards the bottom of paragraph 12, you make the statement that that the columns, and I think you're talking about the columns in the two referenced exhibits, demonstrate how crop demands within Buena Vista often exceed the supplies that Buena Vista has been able to deliver, with the result being that Buena Vista's annual water balance often is negative. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
And in your experience working for Buena Vista, has it been typically the case that that the annual water balance is negative in dry years or wet years, or is there any particular pattern?
Well, yes, typically in a drier year, you are not going to have as much water available. So the surface water supply available is typically not going to be enough to meet the crop demand for that given year.
So you expect to see this negative annual water balance occurring more in dry years than in wet years. Is that a fair statement?
It is. For example, this year is a dry year, a drought. So I would expect that the district would see a negative balance this year.
Has it been your experience that Buena Vista has from time to time operated with an annual water balance that's negative in a wet year in order to be able to participate in water transfers?
I just want to clarify what you're asking. You're asking if in a wet year they had a negative water balance so that they could transfer more water?
Yes.
Is that correct? That has not been my experience. My time there was from 2015 through again portions of 21. Any water transfers that were given that might have happened in those years would not have been enough to tip the scales, if we could phrase it that way, with regards to a positive or negative balance. Typically, there's very few years where, let's say, an average is actually an average. It's either a very substantial drought or it's a very wet year.
Okay, let's, if we could, Ms. Mullen, pull up Buena Vista 1002, which is the spreadsheet. And if we could scroll down a bit, Ms. Mullen, and this may get a little challenging because I'm going to need to look at the labels for these columns, but I want to focus on 2017, which is a little ways down the spreadsheet. So we may have to do a little bit of back and forth, but that's okay. So if we could scroll down to 2017. And you were employed by Buena Vista in 2017, correct?
That's correct.
Now, 2017, we see, as referenced in the fourth column, is categorized as a wet year. Is that correct?
Yes, it would be.
And we see a number just to the left of the word wet, 533,882. And Ms. Mullen, if we could then scroll up to see what that column is labeled. So can you explain to us, Mr. Bell, what that particular column pertains to?
Sure. That column is intended to show what the Buena Vista's Kern River entitlements would be, let's say, the water that entered Lake Isabella in that year.
Okay, so this is basically Buena Vista's second point water, is that correct?
In essence, yeah.
Okay. Then let's scroll down again, Ms. Mullen, to 2017 and move to the right. We then have the number 88,472. And again, if we could scroll up to the label. What does that number pertain to, Mr. Bell?
So that number, which is column 1 at the top, is intended to show the surface water that was delivered to growers, we say at their field. So the water they ordered and the water we delivered for their use.
I'm sorry, what was the word after? So that number, which is column 1 at the top, intended to show the surface water that was delivered. Shall we say after the wet water?
I couldn't quite hear. I apologize.
Oh, all right. You just said one word I couldn't hear. If you could just speak up just a little louder, Mr.
Sure.
Bell.
And I noticed in that the label for column 1, it has the letters that looks like BSA. Is that correct?
Yes.
What
That's it.
What does that stand for?
That would be for Buttonwillow service area.
Okay, good.
Yep.
All right. So we're going to move to the right now. And before we scroll down, let's just look at the column label. So this will be Buttonwillow Canal losses, column 2, correct? And the number as we scroll down, Ms. Mullen, for 2017 is 63,782 for Buttonwillow Canal losses, 2017, correct?
Yes, I see that.
And then we'll move to the right and we see the number 45,893. And if we could go to the top of that column 3, we see the label outlet canal losses, correct?
That's correct.
So is it fair to say that the numbers in that column 3 represent losses in Buena Vista's outlet canal?
Yes, my recollection is it's not only losses and the recharge in the outlet canal, but it would also include the elk reserve that was mentioned earlier and a portion of the river channel. But it's all in the same very close geographical area there.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we move, let's move to the right under the column labels. So now we're at column 4, maples deliveries to growers, to grower turnouts at field only is the label of that column 4. And then we'll move down to 2017. And the number for that year is 6,834. Is that correct?
Yes.
And these are all acre feet numbers, I assume, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. All acre feet.
Okay. And then staying with that same 2017, if we move to the right, we see the number 1,673 for column 5. And then if we can move up, Ms. Mullen, to the label, that label is Maples Canal losses. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and now we get to column 6, which is a column titled Total Water. It says the inter-district lands. Perhaps it should be that inter-district lands. And for 2017, that number is 206,654. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what it showed there.
So when we say total water that entered district lands, I see just beneath that label at the top, it says some columns of 1 through 5. So that's simply, you just added columns 1 through 5 to get that number. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then again, moving to the right, staying with 2017, we see the number 104,460. And if we then move to the top of that column 7, that's the total crop demand in 2017. Is that correct?
No, that's correct. That's what it shows.
And how is that number calculated?
So that number would be calculated by district staff would go out, and what we do is we call it a crop survey. So we will drive the district and determine what the crops are basically. Are they row crops? Are they alfalfa? Are they cotton? Pistachios? What age of pistachios, etc. We can determine when they were planted. And by using evapotranspiration rates from Cal Poly, we would determine what the evapotranspiration would be for all the crops surveyed for the district in that particular year.
Okay. So then we'll move to the right to column 8, which is labeled delivered water supply to the field. And that appears to be a summation of, or the addition of columns 1 plus 4. And the number we have for 2017 is 95,306, correct?
Yes, that's what it shows.
And what exactly does that number represent?
Well, that would be similar to columns 1 and 4, just the sum of them. It is essentially the water that would have been delivered to growers' fields for their use.
Okay, so you're basically you're not including seepage from the various canal losses. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, just whatever was basically delivered to the growers, if we'd want to look at it that way.
Okay. And then again, moving to the right, column 9 now. Under 2017, we have the number 9,154 in parentheses. What does that signify?
So the parentheses signifies a negative number in that year. Are you asking about what the number means or what the parentheses mean?
Well, I guess both, really. Before we get into what the number means, let's just identify the column name. So let's scroll up. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. And column 9 is labeled crop demand balance. And that's columns 8 minus 7, I guess, is the equation there. And so if you could go ahead and just explain in your own words what that 9,154 number means.
Sure. So that would be, and we're talking about 2017 here, that would be occasions where a grower had a need and surface water was not delivered to the field. For example, if his gate was malfunctioning and he couldn't physically take delivery, he may pump the groundwater. So the negative number represents groundwater that would have been pumped to satisfy that crop demand on that field.
And are the numbers in column 9 verified by Buena Vista through any cross-check against actual pumping records, either through well meters or power records or any other similar method?
I can't speak to their current operation. I can say in 2017, that would not be the case. It would have involved getting records off wells that perhaps didn't have meters at the time.
Okay. But as a general proposition, if I wanted to know how much groundwater was pumped within Buena Vista in a particular year, would you say that the numbers in column 9 provide a reasonably accurate statement as to what the groundwater pumping would be?
Yeah, it's a reasonable number given the best available information.
Okay. And then let's move again to the next column over to the right, which would be column 10, total canal and palms recharge. So that's derived from adding columns 2, 3, and 5, correct?
That would be correct.
And then let's drop down and see what the number is for 2017. That number for 2017 is 111,348, correct?
That's what it shows, yes.
And how would you describe what that number represents?
That would be the number that recharged in the ground. Again, it's referring to some columns 2, 3, and 5. So this is in the Buttonwillow service area and the Outlet Canal area we talked about, and in the Maples service area.
Okay. And then the next column to the right, if we could scroll up again, Ms. Mullen, is labeled spill at north of Highway 46, correct?
That's correct.
And then if we drop down to 2017, we see a 0 in that column, correct?
That's correct.
And that indicates to you that no water spilled north of Highway 46 in 2017?
Well, that is an accurate statement. However, this column is referring to water in the main drain canal that is in the center of the district. No water from the main drain canal left the district north of Highway 46.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Mm-hmm.
And then moving again to the right, we see the number for 2017. We see the number 102,194, correct?
That's correct.
And then Ms. Mullen, if we could scroll up, that's column 12, and that's labeled yearly water balance, correct?
That's correct.
And that's the sum of columns 9, 10, and 11, correct?
It's the sum of columns 9 and 10, and then subtracting out column 11. That's okay. Any water.
Do the minus. Yep. Okay. And then finally, column 13, we have cumulative water balance. And for 2017, the cumulative water balance number is 867,704. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that.
And how would you just generally describe what that number represents?
So that number in column 13 would be, if we want to call it the running total of water that per this chart that began in 1968 would exist in the ground for Buena Vista, the water that was recharged.
Okay. Now going back to the 2017 row, Ms. Mullen, if we could. I guess my question, Mr. Bell, is we've we've identified 533,882 acre feet of Kern River water available to Buena Vista in 2017 under its Kern River entitlement. But we've only identified total water entering the district lands under column 6 of 206,654. And we've further identified a deficit of 9,154. I guess my question to you, sir, is where did the rest of the water go? The rest of the water that would make up the full 533,882.
Yeah, I
Objection
don't.
Beyond the scope of the rebuttal.
I'm going to overrule the objection just merely on the basis of the fact that I need to understand this chart. So it would be very helpful to hear Mr. Bell's testimony. So I acknowledge your objection, Mr. Becerra, and I will allow the question.
Well, Mr. O'Brien, if I could just clarify, just so I understand, you mentioned a deficit of the 9,154.
Yeah.
I would not characterize it as a deficit. It may represent water that was pumped, but as I gave in my example, water can need to be pumped for a variety of reasons. If we were to look at a deficit, column 12 would be much more accurate to look for either, in this case, 102,194 in this year, which is not a deficit, which is added to the ground, if you will.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification.
Sure, but to answer your question, Dr. House's testimony would probably be more of a broader picture. I just want to be clear that this chart is related to water in the district, let's say after Second Point. It's water in the district ground, so really doesn't account for an activity of water upstream of Second Point, and that would be an additional area to look at as far as if you're looking for what happened in the water in 2017.
Well, you were there in 2017.
I was.
And without holding you to specific amounts, is it fair to say that Buena Vista transferred a significant amount of water in that year?
Objection beyond the scope of the rebuttal.
Mr. O'Brien, will you please connect this to the rebuttal testimony for me?
Well, Mr. Bell submitted this exhibit as part of his rebuttal testimony. He testified about it in paragraph 12, as we've seen. He testified about how Buena Vista utilizes its canals for recharge, particularly in wet years. And I guess I think I'm entitled to explore exactly how that works physically, since he's already described it, and how Buena Vista operates in these types of years.
And well, maybe remind me of your question. As I recall your question, it had to do with exchanges that may have occurred upstream of Second Point. Is that not the question? Which I don't think is related to.
I think it was transfers, but let me withdraw the question, Ms. Kinsey, and I'll try it another way.
Thank you.
And maybe we could go back to your testimony, Mr. Bell, which is EV 1000, and let's go to the top of page 6. This is the tail end of paragraph 12, which we were looking at earlier. So next page, please. So at the top of that page, you make the statement, you say that means that in order to grow their crops, farmers in the district needed to pump groundwater in those years. Buena Vista's intentional management of its distribution canals to generate groundwater recharge in the wetter years is a key factor that makes it possible for farmers to operate sustainably within Buena Vista. End quote. I guess my question to you, Mr. Bell, is do the numbers that are reflected in Buena Vista Exhibit 1002, which is the spreadsheet we've been looking at, reflect any sort of an effort to maximize groundwater recharge in that wet year of 2017? Because I have to say, it appears to me that a fair amount of water was going somewhere else that's not reflected in this spreadsheet. And if I have that wrong, please correct me.
Objection, vague and ambiguous, and compound.
I think it was the subject of the question, I think, is acceptable, Mr. O'Brien. I think you might agree that was a bit of an awkward question. So maybe
I would
try it again.
call it a meandering question, but I'll see if I can break it down a little bit. So we've reviewed your testimony where you indicate or you describe Buena Vista's intentional management of its distribution canals to generate groundwater recharge, correct?
That is my testimony. Yeah.
And that particularly happens in wetter years, correct?
That would be correct.
And we know that 2017 was a wet year, correct?
It was.
I guess my question is whether Buena Vista Exhibit 1002, in your mind, reflects an effort by Buena Vista in that wet year to maximize groundwater recharge through the use of its distribution canals.
I believe if we were to look at back at Buena Vista 1002, if you were to look at the yearly water balance, you would see that it is the number for 2017 is it shows that a fair amount of water was recharged within the district. More is recharged in a wet year than an average year. So, Mr. O'Brien, I don't know if there's a particular number you have in mind or what would constitute that level of effort as far as recharging water.
Is there water that was available to Buena Vista under its Kern River entitlement in 2017 that was used somewhere other than Buena Vista?
Objection, vague and ambiguous, and potentially beyond the scope of the rebuttal.
I'll overrule the objection in part. It's a question I was going to ask anyway, frankly. I was struggling in my mind as to how to phrase it in a way that's not vague and ambiguous. I think there's some difficulty with the term beneficial use or use. So I'd like to get to the answer here, but I'm not sure that, we're running into things. Mr. O'Brien, I'm sorry to ask you to rephrase it. I don't know if this is the fourth time, but I'm going to ask you to do it because I think you might do a better job than I would. So
I'll give it a go. Mr. Bell, is there water that was available to Buena Vista under its Kern River entitlement in 2017 that was conveyed outside of Buena Vista?
When you say outside,
objection, vague and ambiguous, and potentially beyond the scope of the rebuttal. Ms. Kinsey, I can explain. There's a couple of classes of water potentially in the question.
Go ahead and explain. I agree with. I mean, it's a tricky question to ask. So I'd like to figure out a way to ask it, though. So I am going to stay on this until we can figure out how to ask it. But Mr. Becerra, if you can clarify, I think that may actually help move us forward. I realize you're not testifying, but if you can help describe what you see as some of the ambiguities here.
First, Dr. Howes discussed all of this in detail in Exhibit Buena Vista 50C3. The question appears to be getting at potential transfers outside Buena Vista. It potentially involves exchanges where Kern River water was sent with Buena Vista getting water back. It also potentially involves groundwater banking by Buena Vista elsewhere in Kern County. And so there's a lot of places water went that were not into the Buena Vista service area.
So I think that's fair. I mean, that's exactly what the question was. I mean, to the extent Mr. Bell has the knowledge to testify to exactly that, I think that was the answer to the question. Is that so? Maybe Mr. O'Brien, I can either ask the reporter to read the question back again if you don't want to make a sixth attempt. But Mr. Becerra, do you have anything to add? Let me pause here. Mr. Becerra, do you have anything to add? I mean, that's exactly what we're getting at. Now, whether we go into each of those categories and explore them further, that's another question. And I realize we can address objections to that, but just getting the answer to that, of a yes or no.
If that's what we're talking about, that's fine.
Okay.
And we can break it up into subcategories if necessary.
Great. Mr. O'Brien, back to you.
Yes, and I agree that if Mr. Becerra's statement is the answer to my question, I think I'll be ready to move on.
Okay.
So here's the question, Mr. Bell. With respect to the water allocated to Buena Vista under its Kern River entitlement in 2017, did some of that water get conveyed outside of Buena Vista Water Storage District?
Yes.
But that water that was conveyed outside the district is not reflected in Buena Vista Exhibit 1002, correct?
That would be correct.
Okay. I think I can move to a new topic, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you.
Let's go to paragraph 6 of your written testimony. This is Buena Vista 1000. And in that paragraph, I think we'll need to scroll to the next page, Ms. Mullen. You refer to the number 1,732,036 acre feet, which results in an annual average of approximately 32,680 acre feet. You see that?
I do. Yeah, I do see that, yes.
And that number was calculated based on what time period?
So this would be based on the chart we're looking at from 1968 through 2020, I believe.
Okay. And then if we drop down to paragraph 7, beginning on line 11, you discuss a potential error in the data for 1996, but you state, starting on line 11, if that potential error in the data for 1996 is disregarded, then the annual average total of 33,848 acre feet is close, parentheses, within 4%, close parentheses, to Dr. David's assumed average of distribution canal system seepage and spillage of 35,000 acre feet. Do you see that?
I do see that, yes.
And is that your testimony?
That is my testimony. And just so I'm clear, Mr. O'Brien, my testimony was regarding the use of these numbers as in regards to a theoretical maximum
Yes.
for use in Buena Vista. Okay.
Yes, thank you. If I could have just a minute, Ms. Kinsey, I think I might be done.
Sure.
Just one more question, Mr. Bell. You don't have any information as to whether Buena Vista's predecessor, Miller and Lux, ever managed its distribution canals as recharge facilities in the time period circa 1914. Is that correct?
Objection beyond the scope of the rebuttal.
Mr. O'Brien, that seems like a fair objection unless you have something that you'd like to point to in Mr. Bell's testimony.
I'll withdraw it.
Thank you.
That concludes my cross.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Do any of the other parties have cross-examination questions for Mr. Bell? I do not have any questions. So Mr. Becerra, do you have redirect for Mr. Bell?
No, I don't, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you. So with that, I will thank you, Mr. Bell. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I appreciate you being here and I appreciate your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe at this point, according to my notes, Mr. Becerra, we would be turning to your next witness, who I believe is Dr. Howes. Is that correct?
That's correct. And if we could have 5 minutes or so to set him up, that'd be great.
Of course, yes. Let's take 5 minutes and we will reconvene at let's take 7 minutes. We'll reconvene at 2:40.
Ms. Kinsey, could I ask for 10 minutes?
Absolutely. Let's reconvene at 2:43. I will see all of you in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Ready?
Thank you. All right. Welcome back. I think I see all of us who need to be on camera right now, so I'll get started. I will turn to you, Mr. Becerra. Are you prepared to call Dr. Howes as your next witness?
We are. Buena Vista Water Storage District calls Dr. Daniel Howes as a witness.
Thank you.
And
Dr. Howes, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr. Becerra.
no.
Okay, I will go ahead and swear in the witness. Please unmute your microphone. First of all, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Please unmute your microphone and raise your right hand. Dr. Howes, do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. You may proceed, Mr. Becerra.
And Ms. Mullen, could you please bring up Dr. Howes' presentation, Exhibit Buena Vista 1101. And Ms. Kinsey, while Ms. Mullen is doing that, just for housekeeping, because Dr. Howes is rebutting 2 witnesses' testimony, we've allocated him 40 minutes of our 80 minutes.
Thank you.
Dr. Howes, can you please state your name for the record?
Daniel Howes.
And have you already submitted your statement of qualifications in this hearing?
Yes, I have.
Is Exhibit Buena Vista 1100 your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, it is.
Is Exhibit Buena Vista 1101 your summary of your testimony?
Yes, it is.
Are exhibits Buena Vista 1102 through 1105 the exhibits to your testimony?
Yes, they are.
Dr. Howes, can you please summarize your testimony using Buena Vista 1101?
Sure. Next slide, please, Ms. Mullins. My rebuttal testimony today of the Kern Water Bank Authority experts, Ms. Polly Boissevain and Dr. Jeff Davids, specifically the analysis of diversions of Ms. Boissevain and the analysis of upper range of diversions of Dr. Davids. Next slide, please. So to get started, I want to discuss the fundamentals of a water balance. These seem to be lacking in the Kern Water Bank Authority experts, as I'll state throughout this presentation. So this is on the right, a simplified figure showing the water balance, spatial boundaries, if you will, how the second point group entitlement is examined within the boundaries that I utilize, both the zone of influence and the storage in Lake Isabella and the banking and transfers, and also the ins and outs of other water into from the second point group entitlement. It's important to understand when you're doing a water balance to set and clearly define your spatial boundaries and your temporal boundaries, so the time frame. If you're looking at a long-term average, the comparisons of those long-term averages would be much different than if you're looking at a single year, 365 days, for example. So without understanding and clearly defining what time frame you're looking at and what the analysis time frame is, you can run into a lot of inaccuracies. Next slide, please. So to get started, I'm going to go through my response to the testimony from Ms. Boissevain. This is detailed in my technical memorandum, which is Exhibit Buena Vista 1103. There are 3 different technical memorandums that I'll discuss today. The main concerns are listed here. I'm just going to summarize. Because of inappropriate boundaries, there were issues such as double counting of the same flow. There were issues with accounting for flow that wasn't Buena Vista's in certain times, excluding Lake Isabella changes in storage and losses, excluding sometimes flood channel recharge and including at other times, as well as river channel recharge. Next slide, please. So I wanted to get started in this analysis by clearly showing how water flows around and past second point. So I highlighted here the current diversion weir. You can see that as the sort of red horseshoe shape that I've created. This figure is a figure from my my technical memorandum and the exhibit I previously mentioned, 1102. You can see the second point is right next to the diversion weir. The river channel acts as a conveyance downstream of second point or the diversion weir. Depending on the year that was being analyzed, water would be diverted from the river channel either southward towards into the Alejandro, the old Alejandro, the main canal, river channel bypass. A key piece that I've also highlighted here is the outlet weir. Note that the outlet weir is downstream of the current diversion weir. The outlet weir supplies water into the outlet canal. So the main channel or the river channel is a conveyance. There's many different channels that take off, and Buena Vista supplies water to those channels. And the outlet weir is downstream of the diversion. That's important to understand. Next slide, please. To get started in identifying the issues in Miss Boissevain's analysis, I'll start with 2017 and work backwards in time. I'll go through these at a pretty quickly. They're in a lot more detail in my technical memorandum. On the left-hand side, you can see the figure, the water balance figure. In red, I've highlighted the issues in Miss Boissevain's analysis, and then in the table on the right, you can see my column of my original analysis. Next to that is the corrected evaluation of Miss Boissevain. So if we see for 2017, there was a double counting. She accounted for the outlet weir flow in addition to the diversion weir flow, but because the diversion weir is upstream of the outlet weir, the same molecules of water passing over the diversion would also pass over the outlet. So there was a double counting there. She also ignored storage and losses in Lake Isabella, and she didn't, because of the records she used, she did not include the Carmel rights. So once the corrections and fixes are made, at the bottom, you can see the corrected appropriations and that our numbers are very similar within approximately 3,000 acre feet in 2017. Next slide, please. In 2011, there were other issues. One being that she ignored flood channel canal recharge. She again double counted the outlet weir flow, but interestingly enough, she included the Kern Water Bank Authority recharge. So near second point, the Kern Water Bank, through the Kern Water Bank Canal, takes water from the Kern River channel. That is not second point water, but she included that water as Buena Vista's diversion. So once I correct for those issues, as well as the Lake Isabella losses, you can again see that our corrected appropriations within the consistent analysis framework and boundaries that I analyzed are very similar. Next slide, please. In 1998, she didn't double count the outlet weir flow, but she did incorporate Kern Water Bank recharge again, similar to 2011, as flow to Buena Vista. She ignored flood channel canal flow altogether. So not only the recharge, but also the flow past 46. And then there's flow termed first point used as second point flow, which is water that's used between first point and second point. Second point water used between first point and second point. And then also ignoring Lake Isabella losses and change in storage. Fixing those corrections, we're again within about 2,500 acre feet difference. Next slide, please. In 1983, this is an interesting year. A couple of different things happened. Ms. Boissevain actually did 2 separate analyses for 1983, discussing each one in different parts of her testimony, but really focusing more on the one in Kern Water Bank Authority 223. I went through and corrected both of her analyses. It looked like the Kern Water Bank Authority 242 was a little bit more accurate. They both had issues. Focusing in on the 223, she accounted for flood channel flows past 46. She ignored flood channel recharge and completely ignored the fact that lower river water passed second point and was a portion of the flood channel flows going past Highway 46. So there was approximately 60,000 acre feet that of lower river water that made up some of that flood channel flow going past 46. Again, she ignored the storage and losses in Lake Isabella, as well as the first point using second point flow. Once you include that plus the flood channel recharge, you can see her actual total appropriations are a little higher in their first analysis, a little lower in her second analysis, depending on some rounding issues there. So next slide, please. So in 1978, there was only one issue. She correctly included flood channel recharge in this year, unlike in the previous years. She doesn't include the storage and losses consistently, but this highlights that there's for some reason, a dynamic spatial boundary issue with her water balance analyses. Once corrected, you can see we're within approximately 800 acre feet. Next slide, please. 1969, unlike in 1978, she here ignores flood channel recharge. This is the first time in the past that she doesn't include river channel recharge in her analysis. So once we add the river channel recharge and the flood channel recharge, as well as the Lake Isabella losses, we're within 19 acre feet. Next slide, please. (1952), she's missing again, like similar to 69, but unlike the previous years, she's missing the river channel recharge. And also in this case, she's missing the flood channel recharge. So adding those back, there was no Isabella, but adding those back, we can see that the numbers come in a little closer. Now, this is a particularly interesting year because there's 19,400 acre feet that is somehow traveling around and being distributed past Highway 46. We're not quite clear. It's not quite clear from the records exactly how that water gets past 46. There's a couple of discrepancies. I talked about this in my technical memorandum. One statement says that it went through the Goose Lake Canal, which would have completely bypassed second point, gone and wasn't second point's water. The other record that I used seemed to suggest anyways that water was routed over the concrete weir and then distributed from the flood channel into Goose Lake Canal, which is possible as well. So there's a couple of different scenarios that could happen. That's why there's two different numbers for me, House 1 and House 2. House 2 is matching the 1964 board hearing analysis from the board engineer. And then the house one is my original analysis. So there's a little bit of a range there depending on how one accounts for that 19,400 acre feet. Next slide, please. So this summarizes the analysis year by year. Once Ms. Boissevain's analysis is corrected with a consistent temporal and spatial boundary, we can see that the values are almost identical from year to year in that comparison. So there's some other summary points there, but I'm not going to read them off the slide. They're all detailed in my testimony. Next slide, please. The next point or next portion of this rebuttal is of the testimony of Dr. Jeff Davids. This is detailed in the technical memo exhibit Buena Vista 1102. I believe I misstated the previous exhibit was 1103, and this is 1102. So in this particular analysis, Dr. Davids attempted to theoretically determine the pre-1914 upper range of diversions. We're going to go through, I'm going to go through and show you how his entire analysis was inappropriate in really non-standard overall, and then individually as we go through how it completely breaks down and his assumptions on different aspects just don't hold weight. Next slide, please. I want to be clear that I do not agree at all with Dr. David's attempt to back into evapotranspiration pre-1914, and I believe his analysis approach was completely false and in error. I will go through piece by piece and discuss errors that he made within that analysis, but I don't want you to think that I agree with the analysis framework, but it is important that you understand that there were errors within it as well. Next slide, please. Quick refresher on our water balance. Again, we need to clearly define the spatial boundaries and clearly define the temporal boundaries. That's a huge issue with Dr. Davids, is understanding a maximum, upper range, average. All of that, it completely changes how one analyzes the data. So what is it? And so we'll talk about that as we go through here. We are working on historical maximum. And so that's the way I'm going to frame how to correct Dr. David's analysis. Next slide, please. So Dr. Davids attempted to back into the needed amount of water within this zone of influence. So this is my blue box, zone of influence. He's going to attempt theoretically to analyze evapotranspiration, and with that, determine how much water pre-1914 Buena Vista would have required. He also is analyzing the surface storage and evaporation, and I'll discuss that as well. Next slide, please. So quick refresher, evapotranspiration is the water that evaporates from the soil and plant surface and transpires through the plant itself. When we estimate that, we need two important components. One is the acreage of the relevant crops in the area and the evapotranspiration of those different crops. There can be errors associated with either one of those. I did look at in my memorandum for Dr. Davids the acreage issues and discuss that in that memorandum and the appendix to that memorandum. I won't cover that in detail here. Next slide, please. So I want to make sure that we all are on the same page with understanding some of these statistical terms. interpolation, which is estimation between known data points, this idea of extrapolation, which is estimation outside of known data points, and then what a regression is, really building or is testing a correlation and development of a model or equation that can predict that relationship. Correlation does not mean causation. And what are the issues with regression overall, as well as the fact that, as Hahn in 1977 shown in Exhibit 1104, Buena Vista 1104, that there are a lot of hazards to attempting or trying to extrapolate from a regression. It just shouldn't be done. You can't go outside of the variable area where that regression was developed. So you have a regression that's based on independent and dependent variables. If we're moving outside of those variables, or if those variables change, the regression and the extrapolation from that regression does not hold weight. Next slide, please. So this is Dr. David's original figure, where he suggests that you can work back in time, basing data from 1955 to 1990, and then you can extrapolate back in time using a regression. Yes, I know he states that he didn't use the regression, but he used the red dotted line. Nevertheless, he based his conclusion that a regression would be okay, or that this extrapolation would be okay, based on that regression equation. Note that that regression equation has an R² value of 0.41. I use linear regressions and other types of regressions quite frequently, and 0.41 is a very bad, a very poor R² value, regardless if it's statistically significant or not. As I'll go through, there were in the following pages, there are many problems with this overall analysis. Next slide, please. So other than using a regression with a very poor R² value, this first mistake, this really the second mistake, is to not extrapolate from a regression or an interpolation for that matter. There's no physical justification on why you can extrapolate. For what reason and what purpose do you think that the yields would have been lower in 1885 than they are in, say, 1955 or 1990 for that matter? Without having a physical justification, and more than just because I think it should be, it's not appropriate to extrapolate back in time. It's not appropriate to extrapolate from a regression or an interpolation for that matter when you don't have any physical basis for doing that. Next slide, please. So one of the issues is that Dr. Davids did not use all of the data available. He used one acreage value every 5 years from 1955 to 2020, really focusing his regression on 1990 through 1955. But in fact, there were data points for every year for yield, and those are shown here. Additionally, in Exhibit Kern Water Bank Authority 20, 2018, and 147, the same data points are shown, or data points for yields in the Stanton report are shown from 1930 to 1940. And those are shown as the blue triangles. In the Lippincott and Means report, Thomas Means reports a range of yields between 4 and 8 tons per acre in 1919. So these are the data that are available, and doesn't mean you can extrapolate from them, but it does show that there is much more data available than Dr. Davids used. Next slide, please. So I want to compare Dr. Davids' analysis on the left with what would it would have looked like had Dr. Davids used all the data points between 1955 and 1990. So So you can see the regression analysis on the left has an R-squared value of 0.41, as Dr. Davids noted. And the regression analysis on the right, if you had used all of the data, has an R-squared value of 0.099, which is much, much lower and has no statistical significance. That basically means that slope of that line could be positive or negative, which would have indicated that yield could be higher rather than lower, depending on what time frame you're looking at. You still want to extrapolate. I can feel it that you do. You look at that line and you can see that it's going downward, and you say, well, it can go downward further. We can move it back all the way to 1885. You can't do that. This data is only from 1955 through 1990. There's no justification, no physical justification on on extrapolation back in time using that data. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to move on to the fact that even if the yield was lower, it doesn't mean that the ET or evapotranspiration was lower. This is from Lindemeyer et al. In Dr. David's technical memorandum, given the reference down below here. This uses data from a variety of sources, but they all have one aspect in common. The only variable in these analyses was ET. So they are from different researchers, but all the researchers, the only thing they varied was the amount of applied water and thus the amount of evapotranspiration. So regardless of the fact that they may or may not be applicable to anything, if you only change one variable, you can see that there may be a relationship. The point is, what happens if you look at other variables, like happens in both space and time when you're looking at multiple fields in one region or multiple regions for that matter. Next slide, please. This is a set of data from Hanks and Rita and they're showing data from Tovey. Tovey did research in Nevada. The data points you can see here, the lower data points are for 2 years, and the circles are 1 year. So they're consecutive years, 59, 60, and 61. And what I want to show here is that 2 of the years, while they have consistent yield and ET data, 1 year has substantially greater yield with exactly the same evapotranspiration rates. So the idea that you can both extrapolate from these regression analyses, make the assumption that ET and yield are directly related, and then use that assumption both in space and time is completely ridiculous. This shows one example of that, where the same fields under the same conditions, just a different year, can have the same evapotranspiration rate, but very different yields, about 20% higher yields. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. I think there may be either a PowerPoint or a Adobe crashing moment. So
okay.
Please hold
for
just a second while we sort this out.
No problem.
And I believe we're trying to go to the next. We're trying to go to the next slide.
That's right.
I'm confirming. There we go. They're only state issued laptops. That's all, that's all we have. All right.
Understand.
Please proceed.
Thank you. I want to show this. This is because cotton historically had been such a major crop in Buena Vista. Just to show, this is also a figure out of Kern Water Bank Authority 104, that with cotton, the 2 points that I'm showing you, you can see that there's actually higher ET with less yield in some cases, and more yield with lower ET. So these are squared values really low. There is no relationship between ET and yield in this case. And just to show another crop and one that was important in Buena Vista historically. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I've discussed issues related to space and time, why you can't really use a relationship between ET and yield and try to use that under different areas, different management conditions. One aspect to that would be the cutting dates. So in the early 1900s, it's noted that there were 4 to 5 cuttings of alfalfa. These are crop coefficient curves that were developed as an example to compare what would happen in terms of the plant water demands under similar conditions if you had fewer cuttings, so like you do in the 1900s, early 1900s, compared to current practices, which tend to have 7 to 8 cuttings in the San Joaquin Valley of California. The key piece to this is that the crop, and that's that upper line, the upper flat line on these crop coefficient curves, the crop is at its maximum evapotranspiration rate for a longer period of time. So the canopy is more dense, and well, canopy is at full canopy for a longer period of time in the lower figure than it is in the upper figure. And when you do a weighted annual crop coefficient, keeping everything else consistent, you can see that the actual ET demands would have been higher under those conditions. I'm not saying the ET demands were higher. What I am saying is that they could have been, and they could have been lower, and the yields could have been higher, and the yields could have been lower. There's no evidence to suggest that there was lower ET in the early 1900s, simply because one thinks there should have been, or that yields should have been lower, therefore ET should have been lower, is not justification or evidence that they actually were. There's a lot going on in these fields. They're very dynamic. The irrigation schedules, the cuttings, the management of those fields, the high water table, those all would have impacted the yield and evapotranspiration differently. Next slide, please. So the last aspect that I'll cover is the storage aspect. And this goes into properly defining the temporal analysis timeframe. So in the data, or if you're discussing things like upper range or maximum, those inherently mean a specific period of time. So you have a maximum year. You don't have a maximum average. You have a maximum year. So from that, if you're going to look at a maximum, you really need to include the potential change in storage. And because it's an upper range, that change in storage should also probably be an upper range. So in Kern Water Bank Authority 14, table 26, there's in 1914, actually, the upper range of change in storage in Buena Vista Lake was 148,000 acre feet. That is a little bit more than what was seen in 1952 in the analysis that I did, which was about 127,000 acre feet, but does show you probably a significant upper range maximum, a change in storage that would be expected. It's important to understand it's not the total storage area, but it's probably a good representation of a maximum change in storage from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Next slide, please. So in this table, which is in Buena Vista 1105, Exhibit Buena Vista 1105, we have 3 columns of data. One is the original Dr. David's analysis in Kern Water Bank Authority 100. And then I have 2 corrected columns, the typical wet year, and then an upper range. The difference between those 2 is the amount of seepage in district canal and recharge in the conveyances between second point and the district boundaries. I discuss what those differences are, but for the most part, we can look at what would have been the maximum in any given year as the upper range, and then a more typical, if you will, or wet year type recharge in the typical wet year column. So because the ET was given for 1914 by Dr. Davids specifically, I used 1914 as a proxy year. He presented 96,000 acre feet of ET of applied water. From that, I was then able to correct his reduction in ET, because we know that ET shouldn't have been reduced because crop yields couldn't have been extrapolated downward. And we don't have any proof that ET was any different in 2017 as it was in 1914. So once that was done, we can step through using some of Dr. David's analysis and then corrected analyses as shown in the notes to the right. The reservoir loss is actually taken from Kern Water Bank Authority 14, table 26, which is less than the reservoir loss that Dr. Davids computed. And then the change in storage, again, because this is supposed to be an upper range or maximum, a key aspect here is the values in the green are very similar to the values that were given by my analyses from 1938 through 2017 as upper ranges or maximum appropriations under Buena Vista's second point right. A key aspect to note is that this does not account for Miller and Lux acreage north of Highway 46, which likely would have been irrigated as well during these heavy wet years. So the acreage would have been more dynamic in those times, which would have increased this further. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I have here summaries of the issues and errors and assumptions that were made by both Kern Water Bank Authority experts, Ms. Boisevane and Dr. Davids. I'm not going to go through those again. I've already covered those. But I do think it's important to note that, in my opinion, due to the considerable number of errors and improper procedures, I cannot see how either testimony can provide any useful information. And really, the weighting of that testimony should be pretty low in my expert opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. House. Mr. Becerra, did you have any additional questions for your witness at this time?
I have one very minor clarification question for the record. Ms. Mullen, can you pull up Exhibit Buena Vista 1101 and go to slide 27? And Dr. Howes, you see this is a slide where you're discussing the number of cuttings of alfalfa?
Yes.
When you were discussing the number of cuttings, were you discussing cuttings per year?
Yes, cuttings per year.
Thank you. That's all I had, Ms. Mullen. That's Kenzie.
Thank you. Mr. O'Brien, will you have questions for Dr. House?
Yes.
And would you, I think, according to my mathematical calculation, we'll be taking about one more break before we finish our day. Would you like to take it now, or would you like to go ahead and get started and break in about 20 minutes?
It would be helpful to take it now, get myself organized.
Okay, I thought that might be the case. Let's go ahead. We'll take 10 minutes. We'll reconvene at 3:35.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I see we have relevant folks back in front of the camera. So I will turn to you, Mr. O'Brien. Are you ready at this time to cross-examine Dr. House?
I am. Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. House.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to start with some definitions of terms that you use throughout your testimony. So please bear with me as I try to unpack some of these terms. You stated in your presentation a few minutes ago that spatial boundaries must be defined. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And how do you define the term spatial boundaries in this context?
The boundaries that encompass the area of interest that's being examined.
And in this case, what is the area of interest that's being examined?
Which case is that?
This case?
In my analysis, the figures that I presented in the original testimony, and thus carried into the rebuttal testimony, correct?
Correct.
The spatial boundary for the zone of influence starts at second point, encompasses the river channel, all of Buena Vista's distribution channels, Buena Vista Lake, depending on the year type, depending number of cells that are incorporated in that would change, and both service areas, and that all of Buena Vista's distribution canals includes the flood channel canal to Highway 46. And so that's the zone of influence boundary, or the horizontal boundary on that. The additional boundaries, or what we would incorporate as a boundary, would include Lake Isabella, and then the kind of separate, so that's why I showed them in the schematic separately, the exchanges and transfers are included. The boundaries to those are not set necessarily, but we are taking those flows for those exchanges because they are entitlements and part of the appropriations.
You say they are entitlements and part of the appropriation. Is that an assumption you made?
Well, let me clarify that. In the Kern Water Master records, the exchanges are taken out of the entitlements in those records. So that's what I was referring to on that. And therefore, they are included as a second point appropriation under Buena Vista's right.
Let me make sure I have this right. So I started off asking you about spatial boundaries, as you use that term in your testimony, and you described a number of different facilities and areas. And you also used the term zone of influence. How do you define that term, and how does it relate to the concept of a spatial boundary?
It's the name of the spatial boundary. It doesn't matter what you name it necessarily. It's a name I chose. The spatial boundary and the definition, or at least defining a spatial boundary, a consistent boundary, is what's important in this analysis.
In choosing a spatial boundary that included exchanges and transfers, was that something you decided to do on your own as a matter of your engineering expertise, or was that an assumption that was provided to you by someone else?
Can you repeat that question?
Sure. You testified earlier that as part of your list of areas within the spatial boundary, you included exchanges and transfers of water by Buena Vista. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
Was your decision to do that a matter of the exercise of engineering expertise, or was that an assumption that was provided to you by someone else, that exchanges and transfers should be included within the spatial boundary of your analysis?
That would be my expert opinion.
And what exactly is your expert opinion in that regard?
That we are looking at the water that Buena Vista uses in a year, a maximum year. That water starts at first point. It actually starts above first point. From that point, it has a variety of destinations, and the goal, or the goal really of the analysis, is to determine where that water went. So in order to do that, we have to analyze the destinations of the water from first point, really above first point, now that Lake Isabella is constructed, all the way down to the intertie and past Highway 46.
And in analyzing where the water went, did you give any consideration in your analysis to the question of whether Buena Vista has a right to the water that goes to these different places, or is it just an analysis of the physical facts as you see them?
Physical facts as I see them, and the data that was provided, or that I obtained.
Was water that was recharged by Buena Vista into the Kern subbasin also included within your spatial boundary?
There's a variety of places to recharge water, and I believe that it was all incorporated into my spatial boundary.
I didn't ask you about places where you can recharge water. I asked you whether water that's recharged by Buena Vista into the Kern subbasin was considered to be part of your spatial boundary as you've defined it.
Objection vague and ambiguous as to recharged into the subbasin.
I'm going to sustain the objection because I don't understand the question either, Mr. O'Brien. So please, can you clarify?
Okay, we've spent a good deal of time today hearing testimony about recharge from various Buena Vista Canal facilities and other facilities into the Kern subbasin. Did you hear any of that testimony, Dr. House?
Yes, I did.
And in fact, earlier witness today testified that that's an important part of Buena Vista's operations to utilize its conveyance facilities, particularly in wet years, for groundwater recharge purposes. Did you hear that?
Yes, I did.
So when we talk about the spatial boundary of your analysis, does that spatial boundary include Kern River water that is put in Buena Vista's canals and ends up through percolation in the Kern subbasin?
I will attempt to answer that question. I'm not quite sure that I understand how that's worded. But I'm gonna tell you what I do understand. Water that seeps out of the canals into Buena Vista's groundwater is included within the analysis that I examined. So because the canals are inside my spatial boundary, that recharge that would have occurred is accounted for in my analysis.
Okay. So your analysis really assumes that Buena Vista's strike that. Let me break it down here. Are you aware, based on having listened to testimony in this case, that one of the issues before the hearing officer is whether the operations of Miller and Lux that occurred circa 1914 included operations designed to augment the groundwater supply? Have you heard any of that testimony?
Objection beyond the scope of rebuttal.
Well, I'd like to take that issue on right now, Ms. Kinsey, because I think this is a very, very important issue. What we have going on here with Dr. House is a situation where there was a very skeletal presentation in the case in chief. And then a truly massive presentation through the rebuttal testimony that ties back in many respects to the case in chief. And I'll give you one good example. There was an extensive discussion in the case in chief about this zone of influence issue that we've heard a little bit about, but there was no context provided for that because we didn't have the application of that to the issues in this case during the case in chief evidence. Now we have, through this rebuttal testimony, extensive testimony about what Dr. Howes believes the correct numbers are with respect to the historical use by Buena Vista of Kern River water. And if I'm going to be restricted in my questioning of Dr. Howes to only the information that was provided as part of the rebuttal submission by him, that will be unfair and it will be a violation of due process. And I want to state that clearly on the record, because what we have in this case going on, they could have presented a lot of this testimony in the opening case in chief. They chose not to, and now they're putting it in through rebuttal, and they're going to attempt to restrict me in my ability to question Dr. House. So I want to make that clear on the record, and you will rule as you rule, but I think this is highly inappropriate, and that's one of the reasons why we asked for the opportunity for both Ms. Boisevane and Dr. Davids to rebut the testimony of Dr. House so that they could defend their work against his attacks.
And Ms. Kinsey, if I might respond?
Of course, you can respond.
I completely disagree with Mr. O'Brien's characterization. Dr. House presented in case in chief an analysis based on historical water use records. I believe that his rebuttal of Ms. Boisevane covers exactly the same years. Dr. Davids chose to present a completely theoretical analysis of pre-1914 theoretical diversions. Dr. House has clearly rebutted that. There is no gamesmanship. We are rebutting the testimony presented by the water bank's witnesses in their case in chief. The current, if the issue is that we did not present evidence about pre-1914 use, once again, the water bank's complaint didn't make that an issue. Dr. House is simply rebutting testimony presented by the water bank's witnesses in the case in chief.
May I respond briefly?
You may respond.
The hearing notice made the scope of Buena Vista's water right an issue, clearly. These parties were all on notice that the scope of that pre-1914 right was going to be an issue in this hearing. They chose to sit back, not present any evidence in the case in chief about the quantitative scope of that right. They did present evidence from Dr. Littlefield, but Dr. House did no work to try to quantify that right. The farthest he went back in his analysis was 1938. Now, in the rebuttal phase, he comes forward with a new set of numbers a range of numbers that he holds up as his opinion as to the quote appropriation quote by Buena Vista. And they're doing that through rebuttal. And as Mr. Becerra did a few moments ago, they're going to try now to restrict me from a full and fair examination of the basis for Dr. Howe's analysis. And I object to that, and I will continue to object to that.
Ms.
All right.
Kinsey, can I get in 2 cents here?
Of course you can, Mr. Jacobs.
My
Please
2
do.
cents are simply that the AHL laid out a clear written schedule for written evidentiary objections and motions, and Kern Water Bank filed a bunch of that. And I mean, that's come and gone.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. Does anyone else care to comment at this time? All right, this is going to be a little anticlimactic because I'm not exactly going to rule on this. The issue, and maybe you just, both of you or all of you are anticipating something that I just don't see at this point. To the extent that Mr. O'Brien, you are asking questions of Dr. Howe's, about his testimony that incorporates portions of his case in chief testimony that now is reflected in his rebuttal testimony, that seems fair game. I don't see a problem with that. We're going to have to go back to the specific objection because I've now lost the question where we are. But to that extent, I think that's fair. The other aspect here that I see is we have, and I've laid out, we are going to have Sir rebuttal. And part of my intent with that is to deal with some of these issues that there is, just by the nature of this proceeding, there's a little bit of an off step where, I mean, it's true of any proceeding, that's not an enforcement matter. I mean, where we have both parties presenting their case and their evidence at the same time. And I want to make sure everyone has a chance to respond and we get through and really try to get to the truth of the matter. So with respect to cross-examining Dr. Howe's today, I think, Mr. O'Brien, we're just going to have to work on these step by step, and I might be wrong, but I just don't actually see the problem here yet. So maybe we can go back to, your objection is noted. I'm not making a formal ruling one way or the other. Well, let's just leave it as sort of a global objection. I understood, and I have your responses on the record. But let's get back to the specific question, if we can, that you had of Dr. Howe's, to the extent you remember, so that I can rule on this specific objection, and then we'll go from there.
Ms. Kinsey, I think it might move things along if I withdrew the pending question, and I think I'd like to come at this through a document. I think it'll
Okay.
probably be
Thank you.
better. So, Ms. Mullen, if you could pull up Buena Vista 503C. And go to page 3. It's document page 3. And I'd like you to review the paragraph there, the second full paragraph that starts with the words "in this analysis." Why don't you go ahead and read that to yourself?
Okay, Doug. Okay.
Now, this was a technical memorandum provided in connection with your case in chief testimony, correct?
That's correct.
Does that paragraph that begins "in this analysis" still accurately reflect your general approach with respect to the matters that are discussed in that paragraph, or has anything changed?
No, I believe that it's still, I've even laid it out in more detail or clearer for you in the figure in my presentation.
Okay, but conceptually, the matters described in this paragraph are still applicable to your current testimony, correct?
Yes, they are.
Now, you talk in that paragraph about absorption of water passing second point within BV's zone of influence. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
What do you mean by the term absorption as you used it in that paragraph?
It means that it stayed within the boundaries.
Stayed
And
with,
It
sorry.
stayed within the boundaries. It may have been used during that year for crop water requirements, irrigation. It may have been physically absorbed or recharged and used in later years when it was dry. It's really a general term, but just to be bottom line is it stayed within the boundaries of the zone of influence.
And is there a relationship between the term absorption as you used it in that paragraph and the concept of absorption for beneficial use that was referenced in the proceedings relating to decision 1196 in your mind?
Objection, calls for a legal conclusion.
No, I'm going to overrule it. I think the decision 1196. Well, maybe can you clarify, Mr. O'Brien? Do you mean decision 1196 or do you mean the staff analysis?
Yes,
associated?
thank you for that clarification. And just to further clarify, Dr. Howes, I'm not asking for any legal opinions, but we've spent a lot of time in this proceeding talking about the proceedings relating to decision 1196. And I am focused now on the staff analysis related to that decision. I guess my first question is, are you familiar with that staff analysis?
I have some familiarity with it, yes.
Okay. And is this concept of absorption that you use in this paragraph we're looking at related to the concept of absorption for beneficial use that was used in the staff analysis relating to decision 1196?
Do you mean a physical relationship of numbers to numbers or just the idea of absorption?
The idea, the concept.
Yeah, the concept is absolutely related to that.
Is it essentially the same concept?
I am not going to say that word for word. I have I obviously analyzed more years. I had a different under different conditions. So the idea of having a standard boundary, a standard time frame, the boundary that I used may or may not have been the same as what was used in that staff analysis, but the concept, the idea is similar.
But before you got involved in this proceeding, had you ever heard of the concept of absorption for beneficial use?
Specifically the words absorption for beneficial use?
Yes.
No.
Had you ever heard of anything conceptually similar that was used in the civil engineering field?
Again, it's a term. The key aspect is the boundary, right? The physical spatial boundary, what you call it, doesn't really matter. So I don't think of it as the term meaning anything specific or having any legal connotation. It's just a term that seemed to already have been used for the Kern River. So it seemed like it fit here and for this analysis. So,
what does the word absorption mean to you?
Absorption means to me.
As used in your testimony or your technical memorandum?
I've already explained that, but I'll be happy to do it again.
Okay.
It is what stays within the boundary when doing the analysis. So the spatial boundary of the zone of influence. So it's not water that's flowing past Highway 46. It's not water going into the intertie. And so it's the water coming past second point that stays within the boundary and can be used directly for beneficial uses during that year or stored or managed for beneficial uses in subsequent years.
And you told me a few minutes ago that the spatial boundary includes water that is recharged into the Kern subbasin. Is that correct?
Objection, vague and ambiguous.
I'll withdraw it and break it down.
Okay.
I guess we'll have to, never mind. We went over a few minutes ago, Dr. Howes, the testimony that we heard earlier today from Buena Vista witnesses relating to the use of Buena Vista canals for groundwater recharge. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And when you talk about absorption in this technical memorandum, you are including in this concept of absorption the idea of Kern River water that finds its way into the Kern subbasin. Is that correct?
Objection, vague and ambiguous.
You
We have to
understand-
cut through this some way or other, Mr. Becerra.
I can, are we talking about within Buena Vista, or are we talking about also outside of Buena Vista?
Yeah, my previous question specifically referred to Buena Vista canals. So that's the context. If I need to say Buena Vista for every question, I guess I can. But we're talking about Buena Vista. And my question is whether the term absorption is, as used in your technical memorandum, includes water that percolates into the current subbasin through Buena Vista facilities.
Well, Buena Vista is the in Kern subbasin.
I understand that.
Okay.
So if Buena Vista runs water through one of its canals, and a certain amount of that, and this is Kern River water we're talking about, and a certain amount of that Kern River water seeps out of the canal down into the subbasin.
I don't think you quite understand. Do you mean the aquifer? Because the subbasin is a boundary. It's a spatial boundary, just like the zone of influence. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's surface or ground. It just is a boundary. So to be clear, the water flowing through Buena Vista is in the Kern subbasin. So do you mean it's going to the groundwater aquifer underneath Buena Vista Water Storage District?
How does the Department of Water Resources define the Kern subbasin, Dr. House?
It defines it as a boundary.
It doesn't include the aquifers underneath that boundary?
Sure.
Okay, that's what I'm talking about. Okay?
Okay.
I'm talking about the Kern subbasin as defined by the Department of Water Resources, including all of the aquifers within that boundary. Okay? Are we together on that?
Why can we just be specific and say, does the recharge make its way to the groundwater aquifer underneath Buena Vista Water Storage District?
No, I'm not talking about the aquifer, just in fact that you're anticipating my question, because part of what I'm trying to get at here is whether you're including in your analysis water that Kern River water that seeps into the Kern subbasin and the aquifers therein, and then eventually leaves the boundaries of Buena Vista to other areas of the Kern subbasin. Are you, in your definition of the zone of influence, restricting your analysis to water that stays within Buena Vista, so to speak, or does it include water that goes into that Kern subbasin and migrates elsewhere?
It would have, I did not do an analysis to indicate where it would migrate. I believe that we have other experts that are analyzing that, or you can question on that. The water that I account for seeps into the canals and the river channel and the other canals supplying the different canal systems, and makes its way to the groundwater aquifer. And where it goes from there, I did not analyze, but it is included in the zone of influence because it is Buena Vista's water.
Thank you. That was exactly the question I was trying to get answered, and I appreciate your hanging in there with me. Now, in your, let's refer back to your rebuttal testimony, Buena Vista 1000. Document page 1, Ms. Bowen, lines 22 through 23.
Mr. O'Brien, just for clarity of the record, I believe you said Buena Vista 1000. I think we're in 1100. Is that accurate?
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. Now, you talk in that third bullet, lines 22 to 23, about Dr. David's conclusion that the upper ranges of the relevant diversions as of 1914 was 234,000 to 800, or sorry, 234,800 to 352,700. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, if we could now scroll to page 6 of that document, Ms. Mullen, paragraph 15. And I'd like to call your attention to the sentence that begins on line 23 with the words, when these corrections are made.
Okay.
And then you, at the end of that sentence, you say, Dr. David's analytical framework produces a rough range of 1914 era wet year appropriations under the second point right of approximately 566,000 to 605,000 acre feet. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, I guess I'm trying to understand what that so-called rough range represents to you. And you use the term wet year appropriations. Can you just tell me in your own words how you would describe that range that's identified there on line 26?
We can look at the table. It might be easier to explain that, why there's a range there. And I did discuss it in my presentation, but it would probably be easiest to look at the table and point by point.
Well, we can look at the table, but I'm not so much interested in the mathematics of why there's a range. I'm interested in understanding from you what that range represents in your mind.
Why there's a range?
No, what that range represents in your mind.
Well, a range is a range, right? Do you mean why is it 566 or is it 605? The reason there's a range is because of the difference in basically the amount of time water would have been in the channels and would have seeped into the groundwater aquifer. Under the 605 scenario, it would have been a longer period of time. And under the 566 scenario, it would have been a shorter period of time. That's why there's a range that's shown.
Okay. And when you use the term 1914 era wet year appropriations under the second point right, what do you mean by that phrase?
Well, it's really 1914 is really more of a proxy year. So because Dr. Davids presented the evapotranspiration specifically for 1914, as well as having the change in storage for 1914, and some estimates of losses from Buena Vista Lake storage in that same time frame, the 1914 proxy year allowed me to analyze this kind of 1914 wet year appropriations, which is what would have happened, or what on a maximum upper range of conditions during a wet year.
Let me ask it this way. Have you attempted to go back and review any of the historical data as to what was happening in 1914 within the current Buena Vista service area, or did you simply take Dr. David's analytical framework, modify it to fix the problems you've identified, and that has resulted in these numbers that we're looking at here?
I did not conduct a new analysis as a rebuttal. I am limited to the analysis that we're already done. So this was looking at and correcting Dr. David's issues and mistakes, and utilizing specifically the evapotranspiration component without having the correction that he put in, because again, I've explained why that is. Aspects of the water balance and understanding how to do a water balance, and what does the, defining the temporal or time standpoint that this water balance is being conducted. So using both of those with improved basically wet year and upper range seepage estimates, that's where these numbers were developed from. I did not go back in time and analyze acreage to assess that. I did lay out in my technical memorandum a more appropriate analytical framework that could have been conducted, but wasn't. So I was limited to using the information that was at hand and correcting it.
Thank you. In your earlier direct testimony, you criticized Dr. Davids for not using all the data that was available in a couple instances. Do you recall that?
I do.
And when you prepared your rebuttal analysis, you used certain data for alfalfa crop yield, is that correct?
I showed that there was additional data for alfalfa crop yield, yes.
And what was that? What was the data you used for your rebuttal analysis for alfalfa crop yield?
Objection misstates testimony.
Go ahead, Mr. Bizzari. You can please give a little more detail what you mean by misstates testimony.
Dr. Howes presented a critique of Dr. David's analysis. He didn't present his own analysis.
All right. Well, Mr. O'Brien, I think you can rephrase the question with that clarification.
I'll rephrase the question. In your critique of Dr. Davids, in which you criticized him for not using all the available data regarding alfalfa crop yield, what additional alfalfa crop yield data did you identify that was not used by Dr. Davids?
He did not use the crop yield in the Stanton report, which Kern Water Bank Authority submitted. He also did not use the annual crop yield data from 1955 through really 2020, but his analysis focused on 1990. He only used one data point every 5 years during that time frame. Additionally, in the Thomas H. Means attachment to the 1919 Lippincott report, there was some additional data in that analysis as well. But it doesn't really matter because, again, it doesn't matter what the yield was. Doesn't mean that there was a relationship between ET and yield. Additionally, none of that goes back to 1914 or 1885. So extrapolating backwards would not have been appropriate in any fashion.
Ms. Kenzie, I'm going to move to strike the answer after when he starts with the phrase, and it doesn't really matter. I asked a very simple question about the data that he is criticizing.
I follow that, Mr. O'Brien. That portion of the testimony is stricken as non-responsive to the question.
Ms. Kenzie, I just want to note, I received some awfully long answers from Dr. Davids, and Dr. Howes should be allowed similar latitude.
He will be allowed latitude, and Mr. Becerra, you'll have a chance to redirect your witness as well. So
thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. O'Brien.
The 1955 to 2020 data that you referred to, Dr. Howes, is that Kern County Agricultural Commissioner data?
Yes, it is.
And are you aware that there's also data from the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner on alfalfa yield dating back to 1930?
There's not. That data is fabricated, if for lack of a better term. It's not real. If you look, you'll notice that the same value is used for up to 10-year period, say a 4 acre foot per acre or 5 acre foot per acre. And if you look at other counties in the southern San Joaquin Valley, you will note similar things but different numbers. And it has a lot to do with where alfalfa was as a commodity compared to other commodities during that time. And I'd be happy to explain that to you if you would like to know more.
So you're saying that the Kern County Ag Commissioner fabricated the earlier data regarding alfalfa yield?
I'm saying that they just used a made-up number for alfalfa yield.
And you have personal knowledge of that?
Objection, argumentative.
I'll sustain the objection, but you may ask it in a different way, please, Mr. O'Brien.
How do you know that the Kern County Ag Commissioner, in your words, fabricated the earlier data on alfalfa yield dating back to 1930?
Well, the probability that the yield per acre was exactly the same for a consistent 8 to 10 year period would suggest that that data was not actually measured. The probability that the yield was exactly the same year after year to multiple decimal places would indicate that yield was not actually measured.
Have you done any analysis to determine how that data was gathered and collated?
I attempted to, but I have not found any clear information on that.
So you don't really know one way or the other how that data was put together.
I know that I wouldn't use it in an analysis.
as an expert in this field, that data would not belong in analysis of yield because of the lack of clear measurement, for lack of a better term. It wasn't measured. The fact that it's shown, you can actually, in 1955, the Ag Commissioner changed the way they were presenting the data, and they actually showed the data as ET or as crop yield in tons per acre. Prior to 1955, they do not. They just show total acreage and total yield. So you have to compute using that, the yields, the tonnage per acre. And again, those yields are identical for multiple years in a row, and therefore do not belong in an analysis of crop yield data.
But you haven't done any analysis to determine exactly what happened with that data.
I have not.
Ms. Kinsey, I'm about to switch gears into some statistical issues, and to be quite candid about it, I could use some time to gather that portion of my cross-examination. So if you are at all inclined, I would appreciate your considering a recess for the day, and I would be ready to go first thing tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. I normally like to move this along, although I had the earlier thought that somehow we always end up at the end of the day doing the most difficult review of the most complex testimony. Maybe we should save statistics for the morning. I do want to be efficient, so let me ask the parties, let's just use a little time, and I'll ask the parties, does anyone else anticipate having cross-examination questions for Dr. Howes? All right. I think it does make sense for us to break for the day. Before we leave, is there anything else that we need to discuss procedurally or anything else? All right, I will give you the last half hour of your day back to you. Thank you to all of you for working through this. I think we're conducting this as efficiently as possible. So I appreciate everyone's cooperation and everyone's work today and tomorrow. I will see all of you at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kinsey.
You.
Thank you.